G'day everybody and welcome to the second session of the last Tuesday of the month PME. My name is Major Jeremy Barraclough from Headquarters 2nd Division. These first two sessions are about me, but it's not just all about me. I do have other presenters who are coming along. It includes the likes of Major General Mick Ryan and Dave Kilcullen a little bit later on in the year. As a quick note, our next session is not going to be on the last Tuesday, it's going to be on the 18th of April, and it's going to be delivered with the Executive Director of the Australian Civil Military Centre, Nicola Rosenblum. With that out of the way, I'd just first like to offer credit to the Cove. Thanks for helping us facilitate this, otherwise many of you online wouldn't be able to watch. I'll also add that the views presented here today are my own. They do not reflect the Australian Army, the Department of Defence or the Government of Australia. I'd also offer that the classification for this brief is at the unclassified level and all the material is provided from open source. So my objective today is we're building up on the last session. And what I mean by that is the last session we focused on critical thinking. So what I'm trying to build out today is taking aim at some of the concepts that we work with and we hold dear and questioning whether they have relevance or utility or not. So we're focusing on the operational level of war and as per the title, of course, with apologies to everybody working at Headquarters Joint Operations Command. So what I'm going to try and do in terms of the scope for this is I'll describe where the concept came from, what the Army should be thinking about it, and some of my thoughts about where we think we should go and where our practice should be. This presentation should take around 20 to 30 minutes of me talking, and then I'll open it to questions for people here in the audience as well as for those of you online. We'll see how we go, but it's not going to go for any longer than an hour. Any questions, I encourage them and commentary throughout the presentation via SMS to the Cove phone number, and I'll address them at the end of the prepared remarks. I also encourage you to debate the topic via the Cove website, in your workplaces and in your messes, because no one has a monopoly on good ideas. And this session and the other PME sessions from Headquarters 2DIV will be recorded and retained on the Cove website, so you can use these series in your messes or wherever you choose to facilitate your PME. So let's get underway. I'll start off with the Australian Advocate for Joint Operations. In 1988, General John Baker submitted the Baker Report, which was our keystone document which advocated for joint command within the ADF. He also argued for command at the operational level of war for part of our enduring journey of the joint forces. His report is often cited as the founding reason for Headquarters JOC at Bungendore, and much of our doctrinal approach to the operational level of war comes from his thinking. Now, what I'd offer is our doctrine is not a sacred text. It's just a record to capture what we thought when we thought about it. It's written on paper and we can amend it. So entering this session, I just need you to adopt some critical thinking with me. Critical thinking isn't criticism, fault finding in a process or in evidence or a decision. Critical thinking is that purposeful, deliberate, considered and reflective thought with a conscious and appropriate level of skepticism. It accepts that we don't understand the limits of our own knowledge, and in fact, it accepts that we are sometimes ignorant of things that we can't necessarily see. So, when we think of joint operations, what problem was General Baker trying to solve? Well, I'd offer it's the two concepts that I'm going to focus on today. First is command over joint operations, and the second part, which is the theoretical concept for an operational level of war. And I'll also offer up front that one of those two things is not essential to the other. So why did we go into those two problems of joint operations and the operational level of war? Well, military failures of the 70s and 80s exposed the need to join across the service stovepipes. We needed to get out of those cylinders of excellence that we created for ourselves. And I'll argue two examples of US military history, Operation Kingpin and Operation Eagle Claw, which demonstrated misalignments which resulted in mission failure to achieve the intended strategic outcomes despite the tactical acumen of the forces assigned. So Operation Kingpin was executed on the 21st of November 1970. It was a raid into the North Vietnamese Son Tay prison to recover US POWs. Whilst it was tactically excellent and remains a shining example of joint operations at the tactical level, it still failed. HUMINT, PhotoInt and SIGINT showed that the POWs had been moved on some time ago. When the raiders went in, the POWs hadn't been there for some time. So whilst it was tactically excellent, it was also strategically irrelevant. It was disconnected at the strategic and interagency level. And for the second example, on the 24th of April 1980, Operation Eagle Claw was the attempted raid into Iran to recover US hostages who were being held in Tehran. This attempt towards joint operations was doomed to failure as it involved many different agencies on the ground and many more in support. They were often compartmentalised out because of operational security reasons. Therefore, they actually had no idea why they were providing resources to support the mission. They didn't have any idea of the mission they were intending to support, let alone their part in it. Many of them, whilst the Marines, sailors, soldiers and airmen were individually proficient, the attempted joint tactics were lacking because many of them had never even rehearsed together. Arguably, it was strategically disconnected and the problems aggregated to inappropriate tactical employment, resulting in mission abortion and complete failure after compromise at their forward staging point, including an aircraft collision between a helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft, resulting in the complete loss of both. Now, jointness is not exclusive to a single level of war or command. It requires a pervasive understanding. And I'll offer that in this very, very brief history of the ADF, in that we've always been joint. We've always done joint operations, more or less. And also I'd add that we've functioned without an operational headquarters or operational level of command for most of our history. So the bottom line up front out of this slide is joint operations are not new. They were essential at Gallipoli in 1915 and we've carried on ever since. So one of our first joint institutions was the 3 service chiefs in the COSC. One of them was nominated chairman, and during World War II it exercised joint strategic command at the national level, facilitated and supported by a joint operations and joint intelligence centre. From 1958 through 1997, the ADF was created to sit over the top of the 3 services to provide a bit more of that connection, which also saw the establishment of Headquarters ADF with the supporting staffs. In 1987, Brigadier John Baker was tasked to review and recommend changes to the ADF command arrangements. Baker argued that there were 3 levels of command: strategic, operational and tactical, and these needed to be reflected in the ADF. Following the submission of his report in March 1988, the government approved the establishment of another joint command, Northern Command, to be raised in Darwin and led by Commander Joint Forces Australia. It was explicitly assigned to the operational level of war, whereas Headquarters ADF was to focus on the strategic level of war. The arrangements were, quote, to provide in high-level operations for an operational level commander, the Commander Joint Forces Australia, to be responsible directly to the CDF and located away from Canberra, and commanding the 3 joint force commanders, i.e. the component commanders of assigned land, maritime and air forces. However, in 2004, the VCDF was appointed the first Chief of Joint Operations, and in 2007, with the establishment of Headquarters JOC Transitional, saw a separate CJOPS appointed as a 3-star position to command at the operational level, including staffs and a 24/7 Joint Control Centre. Since December 2008, that headquarters has been functioning from its current location at Bungendore. So it is an interesting anomaly as well that it wasn't actually until 2015 that CDF's formal authority over the other service chiefs wasn't actually legislated. So in 2015 that was corrected. So my point is that the ADF has always had a joint approach, but does the ADF still face problems for which it needs to prepare? And have we learnt anything out of our recent history? Well, what I'd offer is Major General Hocking, in his recent review of our operations in Afghanistan, would think so. We do need to learn from our recent history. Now, not to put words into General Hocking's mouth, because he does not argue for abandoning the operational level of war, but out of the 21 lessons, the 21 key lessons that he draws out from his report, there are some key points relating to C2 arrangements that can infer some challenges that we face with the operational headquarters and the operational level of war. So 6 of those 21 relate. Number 1, a more dynamic, competitive and interconnected future operating environment will require strategy-making systems, forums, cultures to be more iterative and have a wider range of whole of government and expert inputs. So what this means is Our C2 requires a logical connection from the tactical through to the strategic that is reciprocal. It's going back to the dialectic between the strategy and tactical that the operational level of war was supposed to replace. Number 2, defining, reviewing and clearly communicating national and supporting military strategic objectives is essential to enabling a coordinated whole of government effort, maintaining public interest and support, and ensuring those in harm's way at the tactical level have a clear and unifying purpose. So my interpretation of that is it's clearly defining those strategic objectives that are executable by our tacticians. It's the golden thread of logic, so we can link up what our strategic objectives are to what we are telling our soldiers on the ground. It's manifesting the strategy and bringing it to fruition. Number 4, the ADF needs to appropriately balance its educational and overall investment across the tactical, operational and strategic levels to ensure success in future military commitments. So this points to an observed and unbalanced weight in our education and training at the strategic and the tactical levels. We invest a lot of time in our seniors and we invest a lot of time in our enlistment and recruitment and IETs. However, the stuff in the middle is often found wanting. And I would offer that the solution to that is probably not more residential mid-rank career courses. Number 5, robust campaign design and assessment are essential to successfully achieving national strategic objectives and require appropriate education and overall investment. So what that means is usually we just come up with a bridge. We decide our start state and we get to an end state and there's a bridge. My interpretation is that it's not just a bridge. It's not an inanimate object. That's where the art happens. It's not just a non-functioning thing. It is the driver, it is the connector, it's the thing that helps us to understand where we're going and as the system changes, how we need to change our approach. This includes things like operational assessment and campaign design, which will require in-stride assessment and adjustment. Number 8, C2 structures and authorities are essential to promote the exercise of leadership, command accountability and risk management, operational coordination, coalition influence, and to ensure alignment of tactical actions with strategic ends. For example, our partners in Afghanistan, particularly our NATO partners, found the Australian command and control arrangements as both confusing and bemusing. Our Byzantine reporting lines, they created risks that were potentially only solvable either through tactical compromise or missed strategic opportunities. And the last lesson I'll touch on is lesson 20. The ADF is unbalanced in its application of learning due to the current emphasis on capturing lessons at the services and tactical level rather than capturing and implementing lessons along joint, domain, enterprise or interagency lines at all levels. So what that means is assessment and reflection beyond the tactical is perhaps wanting. If it does occur, it's not broadly communicated or deployed or even taken up. So the key thing is that we've had some hard lessons that we've learned on the last battlefield. What we need to do, and my call is, we need to relearn and make sure we concrete in those lessons so we don't have to relearn them on the next battlefield. Okay, so before we go too much further, it's probably useful to just go through some quick definitions here. So I'll refer to, of course, to doctrine, but because our doctrine is not open source, I'll use US doctrine because it is quite close to our own. So strategy. Strategy is broadly defined as the process of interrelating the ends and means. It is both a practice, a process, and a product. When we speak of strategy, we are speaking of specific means to achieve a specific ends. An operation, a military action or the carrying out of a strategic, operational, tactical, service, training, or administrative military mission. Tactics, the employment and ordered arrangement of forces in relation to each other. And operational art, the cognitive approach by commanders and staffs supported by their skill, knowledge, experience, creativity, and judgment to develop strategies, campaigns, and operations to organise and employ military forces by integrating ends, ways, and means. Now, armed with these broad definitions, it might be useful to quickly look at the current levels of war as defined on the next slide. Okay, so starting at the top there, grand strategy. So grand strategy involves also the political level of war, and it also goes by a few other different names. It involves wielding those elements of national power. At the national strategic level, the goals are simply national survival or victory. The strategy will describe what victory looks like or what form of survival is acceptable. National strategy will have supporting diplomatic, informational, economic and/or military strategies. The strategic level of war defines and aligns the ends, ways and means, or objectives and employment and capabilities. The tactical is the achievement of military objectives. Often it's defined by the size of force at the corps or division level. The operational level is supposed to be that connective tissue between the strategic and to the tactical through the design of campaigns or operations in a doctrinal sense. It is armies organised into corps-sized formations, manoeuvring in distributed or disaggregated sequence and often simultaneous fashion for cumulative effective outcomes. Theatre strategic, just to be confusing, is a subset of the military strategic within a specified combined joint force area of operations or a combatant commander area of responsibility. The technical level, which is one we might not be familiar with, is an individual or small unit focus on TTPs and individual soldier actions. A recent scholar came out with the institutional level of war, which is a concept that describes how the force is prepared, educated, and equipped for war. And not to forget our scholars, Yomni describes grand tactics, which is very debatable and is alternatively placed as strategy, tactics, or even operations. Now, this is a lot of layering to pierce through. Is it just level of command or levels of war? Is it preparation or is it conduct? The thing is what value does all of that bring to the party? How does that make our job as strategists and tacticians and even actuators of those strategy and tactics, how does it make our job any easier? And my point to this is some senior generals may seem to seek themselves in the tactical minutiae, much the same regard where we talk about the strategic corporal, the individual who can have a global impact potentially through their actions. So when we look at this, what are we actually trying to solve? Well, I'll offer on the next slide. So the problem to be solved is bridging the gap between strategy and tactics. That's what these levels of war are supposed to be doing. The need to solve this problem is evident when, given the same strategic objective, different commanders might come up with different tactics, often driven by their own biases to arrive at a different solution. And I'll offer that comparison of the USMC and US Army tactics in Vietnam provides an excellent example of how different strategies brought about different tactics. For the table here, we've got represented in blue by the patch is the Combined Action Program for the USMC, and in red, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam patch for the US Army. So the US Army, they came to Vietnam with a theory of victory developed from their expectation that NATO would be combating the Warsaw Pact and would face a repetition of the European wars that had been faced previously. That expectation was reinforced by their experience of large-scale conventional conflict during the Korean War. Success was to be measured in eroding the enemy through large-scale ground combat, an approach that still persists within the US Army today. During the 50s and 60s, preparations for that large-scale war effectively sidelined the USMC. Dissatisfied, the Marines developed capabilities for counterinsurgency in developing nations. Now, the USMC, they always had a bias for small, agile forces. They always had a bias to gain decisive results with the least application of force and the consequent minimum loss of life. Indeed, they went on to develop the Small Wars Manual that's still in use today. Excuse me. So on arrival into Vietnam, each military tribe, they brought their own biases for how they were going to solve this particular strategic problem. The USMC, they took social and economic indicators for their measures of performance and measures of success. The combined action platoons would persist in hamlets to build up the local villager confidence that they could resist the VC. They built up their confidence so that they could reject the VC's demands for recruits and resources and sanctuary. And instead of counting the enemy dead, the caps measured things like rice production, reasoning that each pound of rice that those hamlets could generate was a measure of confidence that those villages had in the stability of the system that they were trying to support. Furthermore, each pound not going to the VC from those villages meant that the VC had to source it from North Vietnam and trek it overland. So it was working out. Now, this, in my own assessment, connected strategy to their tactics, and they seemed to nest well with each other. Arguably, it could have been seen as a thriving success in the small scale that it was deployed. However, the USMC caps were criticised by MACV for not actively hunting for VC. What they didn't see was the absence of fighting as a negative indicator. The absence of fighting, because the VC would not attack the hamlets, they would not attack the cap patrols, because the VC had already been deterred, right? The VC had already been deterred without any fighting because the villagers were already resisting that coercion. However, the US Army tactics, the MACV tactics, they were measured in body counts. They favoured large-scale air mobile operations to search and destroy. And whilst those air-land battle group and combined arms integration tactics were extremely effective in winning battles, it was also strategically irrelevant, as history shows. So as the VC were a political group, unlike the North Vietnamese army, they were virtually impossible to separate from the civilian population. Therefore, they were essentially untargetable, and attrition imposed upon them could be recouped almost immediately. Eventually, the MACV commander, dissatisfied with the Marines' low body counts, directed the USMC to adopt more search and destroy type operations. And given the intended strategy of freeing the people from Vietnam from the communists, it's really difficult to connect that as a thread of logic between strategy and tactics. Therefore, arguably, they were both forced into alternatively failing slowly or surviving failure. So the problem from the Son Tay and the Kingpin, and also the disconnected strategy from tactics we saw in Vietnam going from the 50s through to the 80s, it required two solutions. First, to connect tactics to strategy, and the second was to join forces so that they can step out those service and interagency stovepipes. So the operational level war was kind of intended as a bit of a panacea to solve both of those problems together. What I'll argue is it doesn't actually solve either of them. It just conflates the two problems unnecessarily and not really particularly effectively either. So the operational level of war, it's largely a Western invention. It was discussed in academic circles at the conclusion of the Vietnam War in response to the failures at Operation Eagle Claw in 1980, and it was meant to solve those complex and joint problems. It was first introduced into Western doctrine, as you can see on the screen, in 1982 with the US Field Manual 100-5 operations. It defines the operational level of war at corps and division level and limits it to a specific geographic theatres that are often time-bound into campaigning periods. Now, this thinking is probably what influenced General Baker when he was working through his reports in 1987 and 88. Now, the operational level of war has often and occasionally been cited as derived from variously Prussian, French, and even Soviet doctrine. However, that is highly debatable, and often it's seen as a mistranslation from the source languages at best and a willful manipulation to try and force it in at worst. It's worth reflecting here that global wars have been fought previously. Whilst the joint concepts were necessary, the operational level of war was not, and it's just an invention of the 1980s. So a really good reference for this is Friedman's book on operations. He describes the operational level of war as an unnecessary hindrance at best and a dangerous firewall between strategy and tactics at the worst. The problem is that there's no logical place for the operational level of war. Whilst most definitions on the levels of war focus on things like size of forces, time, or geography, they don't actually provide the logic. So Clausewitz did, however, argue for the logical space for the strategic and the tactical levels of war, as well as the political that informs strategy. The logic of tactics is simply to gain victory on the battlefield whereas the logic of strategy is to succeed in war from the battlefield victories. That definition goes to say that tactics and strategy, they're not a hierarchical layer, they're actually a dialectic where each informs the other. Friedman arguments that there isn't actually any room for anything else. The operational level of war, it's a complete confection that just tries to cram itself in between those two well-defined concepts. And it actually doesn't add any value or understanding to our understanding of war. So to point out some counter-arguments that are usually raised is the Prussian-Austrian War of 1866 and the wars from the Napoleonic era onwards. They're often cited as sources of the operational level of war, but I'd argue that those examples are not necessarily accurate. So to take us back, during 1866, in the Austrian-Prussian War, the Prussian king, chancellor, and the chief of general staff, they actually deployed as a single headquarters, so a strategic level headquarters. And strategy from that headquarters was directly aligned and indeed co-located with the tactical forces on a single effort. National mobilisation was a single, unified, and very well-rehearsed campaign towards a single decisive battle. The well-drilled Prussian organisation for war significantly enabled a much shorter mobilisation than their more technologically advanced and better equipped Austrian adversaries, resulting in a surprising victory for the Prussians and setting a subsequent political and diplomatic scene. The Napoleonic Wars from 1870 and beyond are also often cited as the birthplace of the operational level of war, simply because of their complexity. They saw significant industrialisation during this period of warfare. Armies raised numbered often over 1 million combatants, and mobilisation was over hundreds of kilometres from the battlefront, and indeed the battlefront expanded from a single point to encompass entire nations all at once. The problem here is that none of those aspects are new, even for Napoleonic times. And I'll just offer a couple of quick examples. Hannibal's campaign from the area of modern Spain through to Rome during the Second Punic War in 218 to 202 before the Common Era. It involved over 100,000 Iberian and African troops, as well as horse cavalry and even war elephants imported from Africa. This was a simple strategy to tactics nexus when he executed that campaign. And then even before that, Alexander the Great's wars of conquest, all the way from the Mediterranean through Persia, Syria, the area of modern Iraq and Afghanistan, halting only at India around the period 338 to 324 before Common Era. This involved tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors and significant conquest, as well as agents of statecraft. Whilst it can be argued as joint, it didn't possess or need an operational level of war. And they're not the only examples. Other examples include the Peloponnesian Wars around 431 BCE, the Gallic Wars of 58 BC, the Roman Civil War starting 49 BCE, the Arab conquests of 622, the Mongol conquests of 1237, and even the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1783, just to select a few examples. What they do demonstrate is that historically campaigns like our modern ones, they were complex, involved many thousands of troops, intercontinental lines of communication, combined arms, and often they were joint and interagency. They deployed tactics that were coherent to strategy, but what they did not involve was an operational level of war. So I'll offer this thought up from our own doctrine, which is open source, LWD 1 2017. In examining these levels of war, caution must be applied. Due to the dynamic and interactive nature of war, its practice cannot be divided into discrete levels. The levels of command are closely related, such that tactical actions contribute individually and/or collectively to strategic outcomes. While the blurring of the levels of command is almost inevitable, the effective practice of mission command remains paramount to ensure tactical opportunities may be readily exploited. So to bring us about where we start, the Australian Army should abandon or at least reconsider the operational level of war as a concept. This will probably not mean that CJOPS is out of a job, nor are those staff at headquarters jock. What is required is continuous investment and development of operational art to connect strategy and tactics together rather than contracting each element to separate and disconnected parties. This is never warfare devoid of politics. Rather, it is the strategy informed by politics for the achievement of strategic objectives through tactical application when we wage war. In short, we need to remember that warfare is a continuation of politics by other means. All right, so promise you last slide. What does this actually mean for us? Well, we always start quite linearly, and we need a start state. So consider it as our home conditions or where we understand our origin to be. Most usefully, it might be considered as our current system. When we conceptualize the end state or decide future state, we need an aiming point we need to head towards. I suggest it's not some static point to be reached where we arrive at a halt. What I suggested is that it might be an enduring landmark on the horizon or some desired condition that needs continuous investment. Usually what we then do is develop a bridge between the two. So this could describe the what or the strategic conditions that we wish to impose, ensure or adjust along the way, or the vectors that are required so that we can arrive at our objective, or we can change the current system to the desired system. But to arrive at our objective, we need to backcast and understand the why. So describing the gap between the anticipated future and our desired system and our current system. The strategic intent describes why one future is preferred over the other, and it gives us reason for expending those resources to move from our origin to objective. This necessarily forms a feedback loop that I suggested earlier about the connection between strategy and tactics as a dialectic. As we interact with our system towards our desired system, it's going to change. As we interact with any system, it will inevitably change, and it may even move where we choose our objective to be. Other actors may also impose upon that system, and they may move our start state, or they may put their own objectives, or they might put their own forces in that push our own calculus. So inside that feedback loop, we need a direct nexus between our origin objective, our strategy, and our tactics. So I'll label this connection the golden thread of logic. It's more than just the feedback loop, it's how we connect strategy to tactics. Strategy at origin describes the what is to be done and why, combining conditions and intent. Tactics is the manifestation of that strategy towards and indeed upon our objectives, individually or in aggregation. The art occurs as experienced staffs arrange those tactics that are coherent with the strategy, and they can adjust the conditions and intent and objectives, and indeed it can even provide feedback on the strategy and tactics deployed. So, needing to give it a name, it's the strategy compass, trademark. It provides us direction, and it's really useful to think about it as a compass, because strategic intent is shaped by understanding of the existing conditions and assessing them as acceptable to retain if it is in our interest to change the system or otherwise, and it's achieved only through tactics orchestrated by our operational artists. So, like I said, think of it as a compass. As we move our understanding and engage with the problem, the end state might shift. Indeed, the conditions or adversaries impacting on us may even adjust our start state or start pushing as a force on us, so we need to start cross-cutting to achieve our objective. The needle of the compass, the golden thread of logic, pointing between the two may shift. Therefore, it requires a commensurate course change in tactics through our operational art. So for those of you who'd like to review my work or any further reading, here are the references. Hopefully you'll find that they do support my arguments as appropriate, or at least they make some good relevant reading for yourselves that prompt some further thought. Thank you for your consideration, and of course thanks to the Cove for supporting this event, without which many of you certainly would not be able to participate. If you haven't already done so, please download the Cove app, follow the Cove on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and access the Cove Plus on ADEL. There's some great resources there, including a recording of this and previous sessions of the last Tuesday of the month PME. All right, I'll now open it to questions on the floor here and online if you want to raise any questions or comments. Again, I raise this as no one's got a monopoly on great ideas. Please do feel free to join in. And for those of you at home, you can dial in your questions via SMS to the Cove phone number, and we'll address them as we go through. And after this, I'll also encourage you to debate this topic in your units, workplaces and messes. All right, first question, Chris.
Yeah, Jeremy. So in thinking about getting from strategy to tactics, some construct is needed to do that. Now, the construct that we're using at the moment or debating at the moment is the operational level. It's somewhere, according to the definition, it's somewhere between the two. But it is a theoretical construct.
Yep.
With all theoretical construct, would you be arguing that it's useless? And if it is useless, how do you replace it? Someone I worked with previously said, well, the operational level, and we were working in a 3-star headquarters, the operational level is really about the allocation of resources between problems in the operational area. That's useful to have some approach to making that. It's not strategy and it's not tactics, but you need to get the resources to the right place at the right time.
Yeah, so great question. And I think inside that question there, you said about allocation of resources, and that's actually one of the problems I have with the current levels of war. So we can have strategic missiles or tactical troops, and indeed we do have special forces who are often cited as, tactical forces having strategic outcomes. And where do those resources sit? Well, if we go back to one of the good examples, which again was the Prussian mobilization in 1866, those were absolutely tactical forces, achieving tactical effects. In aggregate, they achieved a strategic outcome, indeed a grand strategic outcome as they reshaped our understanding of Europe at the time. But it is just a concept. So regardless whether it's a level of war or a strategy compass, the key thing that I think we kind of miss out on levels of war is that golden thread of logic. Sometimes it just gets lost in the bifurcated layers. And the complexity comes is particularly when we have the conflation of levels of command with levels of war as well. Often tactical commanders at unit and below are saying they have an operational focus, which is good. We should focus on operations, but it's not the operational level of war. Even when we go to doctrine, the operational level of war is above division level, it's above corps level. So even for the Australians, because of course they have selfish interests, we have the 1st Division, 2nd Division and Forces Command and some other headquarters. So is our whole force just at one level of war? If it's one thing that's not really differentiated, unless we have multiple corps operating, it doesn't really provide any more use to us. So it's useful until it's not. And I think the point that Friedman was trying to get out is by having the split operational level of war and the strategic and the tactical, the golden thread of logic was lost. It was miscommunicated. And then as we saw, particularly in the Vietnam examples, we had lost the connection between strategy and tactics. When we lost the connection between strategy and tactics, doesn't matter how good your tactics are, you're strategically irrelevant. And it doesn't matter if you got good tactics, if you're not connected to your strategy and a relevant strategic outcome, it's kind of unnecessary. So I'd only offer that it's only a value if it offers value. And from those examples, there's a bit of a miss. All right, I hope that answers the question. If not, we can come back. All right, got another question.
Jeremy you cited a couple of historical examples. In the reading that you've done, do they drill into those examples at all in order to discuss how the complexity of those operations may have needed another level of organisational consideration? And I'll give 2 examples here. You mentioned the Punic Wars, where Hannibal led forces across the Alps into Italy. So strategically, a brilliant move. Tactically, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, won a series of absolutely fantastic tactical victories. But he spent 10 years there and eventually had to evacuate and leave his army to be dispersed because operationally he didn't achieve any effective outcome to bring a conclusion to the war. And as a counterpoint, you look at Trajan's campaigns in Dacia in 101, later on 105 AD. In the first one, they just walked in, assumed they were going to walk over a barbarian nation, and were roundly defeated in a series of tactical actions because they were disconnected, even though the strategy was the same as what they'd used successfully previously. The strategy and the tactics was disconnected, so when they went back in, they had arranged a more complex and nuanced campaign, arguably at an operational level, which then, maybe using your golden thread, tightly connected the tactics they were employing with the strategy of defeating the Dacians. So as the reading you've done identified that there is potentially a connection between having something at operational level in between tactics and strategy that provides for better outcomes in complex warfighting situations?
Yeah, so great question. I love the examples. We learn so much from our history. So just to speak broadly, what we found when we read into these historical examples is you'll find the strategic leaders actually involved in the tactical battles. So that provides a lot of, the strategy to tactical connection. Indeed, you go back to the wars of conquest through Europe, sovereigns would be leading their own forces on the field of battle. You look at the English civil wars, sovereigns were on the field of battle. So that provides you a connection. And then the argument is, and what you're alluding to with that second example particularly, is the complexity as it arose. And, again, going to Hannibal's example, pulling resources from one continent, war elephants for goodness sake, bringing war elephants across from Africa to Spain and then marching them all along the Iberian coast over the Alps to then lay siege to Rome. And then, a couple of strategic decisions later, he had to pull back. But they were big and complex times before, in the 300 before the Common Era, right? So they were always big and complex. To get to your point about the bit in between, in your second example there, you hit it on the head there. There needs to be that connection between strategy and tactics. And what you often find when forces are disaggregated is when, particularly in those historical battles, is when forces are disconnected from their sovereign. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they need another layer of command in between, because we've had other theatres of battle. So you look through Napoleonic Wars, many of the American Wars of Independence, there's disaggregated forces functioning quite coherently because they had a unifying logic from strategy and tactics without the need for another layer of command. Indeed, Hannibal, he didn't have any more communications. He had to issue orders and then move out and then trust, because by the time he was getting to Rome, he wouldn't really know if the forces were going to make it there or not. And he even had to make some adjustments in his homeland to make sure there wasn't a revolution while he was away. So what I'd argue is that it doesn't need to be another level of war. It's useful as a concept until it's not. The thing that it sometimes dilutes is what that thread of logic is. And I argue that the filling in the middle of the Oreo doesn't necessarily provide you that connective tissue between the two. We need a pin that can go through and connect the two quite coherently so that the tacticians on the ground understand the strategy and the strategists understand the feasibility of the tactics that they're seeking to impose, and that cycles through the strategic intent and conditions of the whole system. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation, Jeremy. Paul Middleton from Headquarters 2DIV. Just wanted to pick up on the thread of question and response that's already been running. So if we set aside the operational level of war and say that it doesn't exist, where do we then start to net out on the use of the operational level of thinking, the operational art, as part of our skill set in filling in the Oreo? And I ask that with the knowledge of a contemporary example. So because we've covered some far distant history, but I'll give you something more relevant. In JTF 629.2, so during the COVID response in Victoria, part of what the ADF support team was asked to do was to provide some assurance to support the Emergency Management Commission.
Yep.
And it was about if we had our time again, would the government's response to COVID-19 look like what it is today? And everyone could have agreed no, but not what it would look like. And we stepped through strategy, an operational framework, but not necessarily an operational warfare level, but used a set of tools to allocate resources and effects at a broader level above tactics, and then relate that down to a series of tactical effects. And that was the kind of backproof that we provided to the Emergency Management Commissioner. So very, sort of intellectual sort of rigor to provide assurance to government. And it struck me as a very valid and useful framework to aid our consideration of complex problems. And therefore, I'm an advocate of calling out operational art and operational design, but I can see where we should fall short of advocating for an operational level of war. Just your reflections on that.
Yeah. And one of the points I'll take out of you referred again to resources, and that's often what it comes to when we think about the levels of war. And that's indeed some of the definitions, the doctrinal definitions. They talk about resources in terms of forces assigned, and you see, strategic weapons like nuclear weapons. They're strategic assets, or certain ISR capabilities. They're strategic capabilities, and even special forces are seen as a strategic capability. Submarines, again, a strategic capability, but they're all tactical things. They're all a manifestation of strategy, right? So, what's the thing in between? Well, it's really hard to say. Doctrinally, it's multiple divisions is the operational level of war. Given for the Australian experience, we're going from the strategic centre to the operational level of war. There's not much gap in between there, and then we're straight at the tactical level, because the tactical level of war is division and below. So what I'd offer is, when we talk about strategy is specific means to specific ends, and then the tactics is the ways we achieve it. So if we've got ends, ways and means, logically, what else is left over? If it's just allocation of resources, then in my simple mind, it's if we have a thing in between strategy and tactics as a level, is that operational level of war just being postman pat and handing it from strategic down to tactical? What I would say though is we need to not get confused operational level of command, operational level of war. And the thing that we really need to invest in is operational art. Operational art is those staffs at the strategic and tactical level that develop those coherent plans, assessments, and campaigns that understand and can know their environment, their mission, and their tasks and their strategy, and adjust and recognise and anticipate those changes so that they can synchronise and orchestrate so that tacticians can do what they do best. I'm sure that doesn't answer your question.
No, I think it does. And I think the summary is, the operational level of war perhaps doesn't exist, but the operational art is how we draw the thread.
Yes.
In the example that I gave, quite a contemporary example, we spent a lot of time drawing the threads and aligning between different departments and different agencies at a higher level than tactical application, in order to try and align the thinking and the cohesion across a wide range of organisations. So the art came into it in ensuring that the thread of logic was maintained between strategy and the tactical effect. Yeah.
So I think we're in violent agreement here.
I think we are.
The art is how we achieve that golden thread of logic. Okay, thank you very much, sir. So we have a question from online now. So the question we have is, doesn't the operational level come into its own when fighting in multiple theatres, sequencing and resourcing tactical actions in support of strategic aims, resources allocated at the strategic level? For example, World War II saw multiple theatres, some well resourced, some not. Each theatre command at the operational level was given a mission as part of a strategy to win the war. Operational level may be less relevant when resourcing is not an issue. For example, post-World War II, And that was from Major James at Drocker. Okay, hey, thank you very much, James, for your question. And absolutely, I think you're hitting on some of the points we were trying to get at here. And we go back to the doctrinal definition. It's as you've said in here, operational level of war defines geographic bounds, as in theatres. And in the levels of command, we had the theatre command indeed was in there as well. But what I would offer is, what's the difference between an operational theatre and a tactical theatre? If we're going to put a division or multiple divisions to a core level, arguably that's still the tactical level of war, and those are tactical units achieving tactical effects in aggregate towards a strategic outcome. So it is splitting hairs, but my point is that if it's not actually offering anything of utility, then perhaps we need it. And if it's already achieved by the logic of strategy and tactics, then perhaps there is no space for the operational level of war, as long as we have appropriate levels of command and control to achieve it. All right, thanks very much for your question. I hope it answers it. We have another one from the room.
In regards to when we're using the examples of ancient up to Napoleonic times, I think we have to be very aware that the people who were leading those armies were also the leaders of the countries. Yeah. So therefore the strategists were there at the tactical level. And so therefore that golden thread, as you talked about, was very, very short and not necessarily a very good example where we are right now here in Australia, projecting people into foreign fields. So just want to say that one. The second part is when we look at, say, the arguable failure of Russia in Ukraine currently, is arguably that golden thread is too short, where strategy from Putin is reaching down to tactical, where the operational side has fallen down. I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, great question. And absolutely, thank you for challenging me on that thread of logic. And I absolutely agree with you. So for those historical campaigns, that was absolutely the sovereign would accompany the tactical troops on the field of battle. So it wasn't so much of a golden thread of logic, it was a golden point of logic. Yeah, so you're absolutely spot on with that. And I'd offer that the shortness of the golden thread, yes, it was a challenge, but then if we look at things like the American War of Independence, the American Civil Wars, which were far more disaggregated and multiple leaders functioning at the same time, but they could collaborate and communicate towards a common strategy. So whilst they didn't have an operational level of war, they did have strategic level of communication and collaboration, so that those revolutionary generals could actually function cohesively when they deployed their tactics against the British, and then north versus south. So I absolutely agree. Short thread of logic. As to the challenge for what Russia and Ukraine are facing today, I still think it's probably a bit too close to call and draw too many lessons out of it just now. And I'll leave those sorts of things for Major General Ryan when he comes and talks to us later in the year. But thank you for your questions. Thank you for everybody in here, and thank you for those online. Really appreciate the interaction. So that concludes the session for today. And I'll also take the opportunity now to promote the next session, which will be on the 18th of April due to Anzac Day. It's going to be delivered by Nicola Rosenblum, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Civil Military Centre. And she'll be speaking on interagency cooperation and complication. So thank you very much for joining me on the last Tuesday of the month PME, and I'll see you on the next one.